You know what would be helpful is if I unmute before starting a webinar. But hello, everyone. Welcome to the final live chat in the 2023 series about the AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowships Program, also known as STPF. I'm glad you're joining us for today's chat. My name is Marav Sarwar. I'm the recruitment director for the STPF Fellowship, and I will be your moderator for today's chat. And this live chat is designed for you, our fellowship applicants. If you're applying now or in the future, this series is an opportunity for you to learn about STPF and the application and interview process directly from fellows. To put today's session in context, we've hosted one chat each month during the application cycle, June through October. We focused on unique aspects of the fellowship experience that were meant to answer your questions. And this chat right here represents the end of our series. And so we're thankful for all of you attending this or any of our prior chats. And so, in speaking of applications, STPF is accepting applications through November 1st, so 13 days from now. They're a paid 1-year full-time commitment in Washington, D.C. Someone who applies by this year's deadline will be considered for a position in the fellowship class that begins next fall. For those of you who are applying or thinking about applying next year, we're so glad that you're here, and we hope that you leave with a deeper understanding of the fellowship and energized to hit submit by November 1st. And for those of you who may be a few years away from applying, it's great that you're here too. You'll hear advice from our panelists that you can keep in mind as you consider STPF and your career path. For a brief overview, again, these fellowships are an opportunity for doctoral level scientists, social scientists, and engineers to spend a year contributing their expertise to federal policy. Paid 1-year full-time commitment located in Washington, D.C. If you're eligible to apply, or if you're interested in an application overview, please visit our application portal. We'll put a link in the chat box now. Okay. And on to the purpose of today's chat, getting answers to your questions. And so use the question box in your menu bar as shown here. And if you like, you can also indicate the person or people to whom your question is directed to. We'll try to get to as many questions as we can today. And I am happy to introduce you to our fellows. Jacqueline Brennan is a biomedical engineer with a passion for developing data-driven solutions for a more equitable, healthier world. She's currently serving as a data scientist for the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, in the same office where she recently completed her AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellowship. Here, she supports monitoring, evaluation, and learning efforts of life-saving humanitarian assistance, helping the U.S. government effectively respond to global disasters while establishing foundations for long-term recovery, risk reduction, and the journey to self-reliance. Before joining the 50th class of fellows, Jacqueline was a Congressional Science and Engineering Fellow for Representative Anna Eshoo, Chairwoman of the Energy and Community Health Subcommittee. In this role, she helped formulate and advance the Congresswoman's public health and healthcare legislative priorities, including strengthening accessibility and equity of healthcare, pediatric and maternal mental health, diversity in clinical trials, and establishing the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health. Jacqueline earned her PhD from George Washington University and Master's of Science from the University of Oklahoma, specializing in cardiac electrophysiology and innovative treatments for heart disease. She's also a proud Hokie, having received her BS from Virginia Tech. Thank you, Jacqueline, for being here. Georgia recently served as a senior advisor for biotechnology and bioeconomy at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. As senior advisor, she coordinated a variety of initiatives, including drafting and implementation of an executive order on advancing the American bioeconomy, as well as launching a White House initiative to improve indoor air quality. Prior to OSTP, Georgia was a AAAS Science and Technology Policy Fellow at the Department of State in the Office of Biological Policy staff. She worked on international and domestic biological policy, helping to coordinate U.S. involvement in the Biological Weapons Convention and leading efforts in biosecurity and biosafety policy and programs. In 2019, Georgia served as a AAAS Science Policy Fellow in the U.S. Senate and worked on climate policy, air pollution, bioeconomy, and the COVID-19 response in Senator Markey's office. She led the writing and introduction of 3 bills in the Senate, one of which has become law through the CHIPS and Science Act. Before coming to DC, Georgia worked as a scientist in the DSM Innovation Center in Boston, leading an initiative to develop products to reduce antibiotic usage in animal agriculture. Georgia received her PhD in biological engineering from MIT, working at the intersection of infectious disease, genomics, and microfluidics at the Broad Institute. Thank you both for being here. Two incredibly impressive people to talk to, and excited for the audience to learn from you all here today. So before I go to questions from the audience, I'll kick it off with one. What initially drew you to policy fellowships, and when and how did you decide to apply? So Jacqueline, would you be able to start us off on that question?
Sure, thanks for that introduction. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. I was saying before this call, I always loved sitting in on these sessions when I was looking for ways to improve my application when I applied. So hope some of these are helpful for you all. But yeah, so I'm a Washington, DC, and Northern Virginia native. And so I've been in this area for quite some time and had a lot of friends and family who've lived in this area and who've worked for politics and government agencies. And so I've been surrounded by it, very inspired by their enthusiasm, but never thought that politics or government was something that I could get involved in as a scientist and engineer. Educationally, my interests have always just been science and engineering. That's just what I'm drawn to. And my doctoral work was in biomedical engineering. And so I felt that that was something that was very different than government, and there would be no place for me. You know, engineering itself is something that experiments are conducted in very controlled environments, and particularly since American politics is not well known for being a controlled environment. So not something that I really saw myself in. But when I was in graduate school, I spent that time trying to figure out what it was that I wanted to do. I loved being close to the science and working with science, talking about science, but doing it day to day was quite emotionally taxing for me. As I mentioned, I was a biomedical engineer, and so my doctoral research was investigating heart failure, and to do so, I had to do experiments on a wide variety of mammals, rats, mice, rabbits, and then human donor hearts. And it was very interesting work. It felt very relevant and applicable, but I had a hard time with just like the emotional toll that it took on me doing those types of experiments. So knew I wanted to stay in the DC area from where I got my PhD, but wanted to try something new. And so I found out about this fellowship through the Fellows Network. There's a lot of us still here in DC, and so got to speak with quite a few and learn about it, and just thought it'd be a great place for me to try my hand and understand more about politics, not really thinking this could be a place where I would stay permanently, but I'm loving it so far. I'm actually staying on after my fellowship in the same office that I did my recent fellowship in. It's just been very, very interesting work, very rewarding, and I still get to identify as a scientist and engineer, and but still really contribute to bigger things and broader initiatives through the federal government. Maybe I'll just stop there. I'm sure there'll be more time for other questions.
Definitely. And Georgia, same question to you on like what initially drew you to policy fellowships.
Sounds good. And just give me a thumbs up if audio is good on my end.
You sound perfect.
Great. Yeah, I think I have a similar story to Jacqueline, and I think many others that I've interacted with the fellowship, that I love doing science, and I also was a bioengineer by training. And I think I just reached the point that at some point I recognized that I was really interested in the world and society in a broader way. And while I liked thinking about science, kind of the day-to-day of doing benchtop experiments, or running fermentation runs, or running aluminum MySeq runs, didn't quite whet my appetite for the kind of impact I wanted to have in my career. And I think for me, there was a light bulb moment when I thought about policy that I was like, whoa, cool. This is not academia. This is not industry. And this is not the third bucket of other that universities really generally throw out to say, these are the three buckets you can go into. When I was in Boston, that other was often filled by venture capital or consulting. And for me, this was like it was a light bulb moment when I thought about this fellowship, because I was like, oh, this is public service. This is an opportunity to go work in the federal government and do public service, do mission-driven work at an organization that the mission is the priority, not the bottom line revenue is the priority. And you can use science expertise on how you just think and ask questions and approach problems and apply that to some big picture thinking and policy. So for me, it was exciting to kind of think about a new opportunity in the space, and I've really enjoyed being down in DC, and so have stayed, spent some time at the State Department and then at the White House for 2 years, and really have found it a tremendous journey down here. So I think the opportunity to kind of expand, still work on science, but work on it from a very different angle was really exciting.
Awesome. Thank you both for sharing. So we are 13 days away from our application deadline, and we have this webinar as a way for folks to kind of like ask their questions on the application and tips on the process for the two of you. And so as much as I want to answer these questions on my own, I'm going to try to give you guys space to answer them how you would approach them. So we have a question from the chat already, who's diving right into the application, but they're asking, how specific should someone be about the types of policies we'd like to work on in our application? And for legislative branch applicants, should we list specific members of Congress we'd like to work with?
Is that directed to either one of us?
Either of you can take it.
Go for it, Jacqueline.
Okay. Yeah, so I mean, that's a really good question, and something that I was wondering as well when I was an applicant. I'd say it's good to have an understanding of things that interest you and things that you might want to work on, but know that if and when you get into the government, particularly thinking of the legislative branch, policy areas that you work on might be completely in flux. And portfolios are quite large. And so maybe you have one very niche interest in a particular policy topic. But for me, so I worked in the House of Representatives with Congresswoman Eshoo, and I covered the health policy portfolio, which is a very large portfolio, much larger than I had initially expected it to be before I joined. So I already had some interests in some policy areas, but the whole fellowship is a learning experience. The offices understand that, AAAS understands that. And so it's really a place where you can come in with some ideas, but understanding that it's a year-long experience for you to learn as much as you can. And you're not expected to come in having known everything about a particular policy topic or area. And then the second question was about identifying who you want to work for. The members, so the lists for the members who are open to taking fellows comes out, I believe, just like the last week or the week before the fellowship interviews are, that week of interviews. So you can have an idea, and I think that's great to create a short list of who you might want to work for and speak to some staff members if you want ahead of time. But I think all of the members are extremely interesting, and you can do really good work. And so yeah, I mean, and then you don't know who all will be actually accepting a fellow and willing to host one in their office. And so it's kind of in flux. I'd say it might just limit you to try to identify one person, one policy topic ahead of the application, because things very well might change. But it's all very interesting work, lots of great policy to work on, and lots of great members of Congress who could really use help from scientists.
And if I could add one additional piece to Jacqueline's, I think, really helpful overview. I think the way I approached it, and I think I've seen others successfully do so too, is when applying, it's useful to identify a topic that you'd be really excited to work about and that you can talk about and speak to, like one or two topics to say, here are two example areas that I would love to work on, but also present that you're open to adjusting and being flexible and working on different topics, as she addressed, because it might totally change. But I think the way to not approach it is to say, I could work on anything, and then therefore you don't talk about anything in your application. I sometimes struggle with that because I was kind of like, I could work on anything from biotech to climate policy. ended up working on climate policy, which I knew nothing about. But I think it is important to show, even though that may not be the thing you work on later, to show some coherent thought around at least one or two topics when you discuss it in your application.
I think about that point that you made earlier too, Georgia, of like, this is a public service that you're going into, right? And so the idea of like kind of like walking into the fellowship and having this, like, I want to work on this very specific policy and impact in this way, I think like doesn't, you know, and that might happen, but I think like, again, having that flexibility is something that I've heard so often from fellows and like kind of like coming into the interview process and having, I think you summed it up really well in that with trying to make sure like, yes, like have your interests, you know, tell us what you're good at, but at the same time kind of like being open to what isn't needed in the moment can certainly really, really well. And it's a hard thing to demonstrate, but I think it's you know, making sure that you're trying your best to demonstrate that just in the application throughout the interview process. I think that makes you a really competitive candidate. Yeah, so our second question is, if I have limited to no formal science policy training because I was not able to pursue outside activities or internships, will I still be competitive? Should I address these limitations in policy experience in my application? I have held leadership roles in my department, student council, education outreach, science communication. So basically, this person hasn't had science policy experience. How can they address that on their application?
I can maybe take this one first, and then if Jacqueline wants to add on. I think you are most definitely competitive, even if you do not have policy experience. You can be competitive. I think it's important for you to talk about it in the right way and to recognize the strengths that you do have. So something that will be a, you know, a skill that we all need to develop post grad school is how we can successfully apply to things and show that the skills you've learned from the potentially 5+ years of grad school are applicable beyond doing just like bench work. At least that was a challenge I had to face. So being in a leadership role in your department or being on the grad student council, most definitely you've thought about policies within your department, like policy with a lowercase p and small scale policy. And you've probably been reading the news and you have opinions about the news and you have opinions about either health topics or energy topics or justice topics, like whatever it is. And you're probably decently informed on those because you read from a variety of literature. So all of that, I think, can be articulated well in a successful application to say why, number one, you're really interested in, right? There has to be the intersection of two things. Number one, you have to demonstrate a really clear interest in working in policy and working in science policy. And then number two, you have to say that you think I will be successful in the environment that I'll be put in. And I think it's easier to, you know, maybe point to on a line on your resume that says I've been part of this policy club or policy experience, but by no means can you can still articulate it through other experiences. And so maybe I'll just pause to actually take a moment. I think there's like one or two pieces that might be useful to articulate when you think about policy. One is you need to show a demonstrated interest in policy. So it's easiest if you can have on your resume, oh, here's like, you know, for the past 2 years, I've done this thing, therefore I'm interested in policy. If you don't have that specific thing to point to, find another way to demonstrate and articulate why you care about policy. And then I think maybe the second area is that once you're in a policy environment, you have kind of a sense of what your job or role would look like. And so it might be easier if you've come and visited Congress through an organization you've been a part of. But if you haven't, that's okay. You can do your own, you may have already done your own research by having some phone calls or reading online or talking with others. And so just articulating, I know what I'm getting myself into if I'm going to come work in Congress or I'm going to go work at the National Institutes of Health or otherwise.
I think Georgia just hit it the nail on the head there. I think those are all, I don't really have much else to add to that. I think that's yeah. And just, you know, when you come in, I didn't really have much policy experience per se of what I thought policy experience was supposed to look like ahead of the fellowship, but you learn, and as Georgia mentioned, you know, that willingness to learn, that willingness to be a part of something and to have a general sense of the ecosystem that you might be going into, and ways that you might be able to fit into that. But it is just a very much a learning year. And so it's expected that you're not going to know everything there is to know about policy ahead, just how you would be able to succeed in those kinds of environments.
Thank you. I really do love this next question. Something I get a lot of when I'm recruiting at recruitment tables. Folks who are like grinding at academia and really kind of frustrated with their current experience, thinking about different opportunities to look through afterwards. And so this question is, how open should an applicant be about wanting this experience to be an opportunity for a career change, i.e. wanting to explore something beyond academia? Was this something that you all had in mind when you were applying?
Jacqueline, yeah, we can just rotate. Go first.
Okay, that makes it easier. Protocol. Yeah, I was not sure what I wanted to do. I think the statistics are that about 40 to 50% of fellows tend to just stay in the policy realm, and then about a quarter to a third will return to the sector that they were already in, and then a quarter to a third will use it as a springboard for something completely different that's not in the policy realm or at their previous position. So how open to be about this in the application? Whatever you're feeling at the time, understanding that interests can change. Once you get in there, you might have a great experience and want to continue that work that you've been doing for the fellowship, or you might get that experience and in doing so find out another opportunity that can springboard you to something else. I think just whatever you're feeling in the moment is perfectly fine for the application. There is just such a range of interests from different fellows as they apply. So as long as you are true to yourself, just be honest with your intentions and honest with your interests at the time, then I think that's been really well received. I applied a couple times. Like I said, I did the legislative branch fellowship and then the executive branch fellowship, and my interests did kind of shift a little bit between those two fellowships, and so my applications look a little bit different, but still received the fellowship. So I don't think that it was a hindrance for me. Over.
Yeah, and maybe just thinking of things to add on, I agree that was really good perspective. Other things that maybe I approached with my own personal story was, like when I was in grad school, I was thinking about AAAS as a pivot point, that I wasn't sure. I didn't want to go into academia, and I spent some time in biotech industry, but I was really excited to explore something else and kind of leave the bubble of academia. And AAAS, the fellowship, seemed like a really good opportunity to do so. And so that by no means is it that is clearly apparent. Many people go either directly from postdoc or grad school. I was working in industry for a year, which actually was really valuable. I think I'm glad I had that experience. But I think articulating that, and it is probably most important to just show that you know what you're getting yourself into. You know what you have to offer to the fellowship, what you have to offer to a potential office, whether it's in the executive branch or the legislative branch, and that you see this as a fellowship training period, a 1-year period that you're going to come in, you're going to learn a lot and do your best to contribute. And then it could be any number of paths that you move to from there. I think in the application, it's probably best to paint some vision of what your current snapshot could look like. Like, what would the next couple of years of your career look like, even though you may not follow it at all? Just pick a scenario that seems like your best guess of right now and paint that vision to say, oh, with 1 year of experience at NSF or Department of Energy or in Congress, I would do X, Y, and Z moving forward. I think that's helpful in the process, and that at least helps you try to envision what your future might look like, even though it may change, and that's okay.
I think, and something I've heard from talking to members of our selection committees is that, I think being able to demonstrate like what you would get out of the fellowship that you're not getting currently, right? And so, say if you are frustrated in like wherever you are, being able to say, here are the things that I see in the fellowship that I do want to work on, and not being able to access that now in your current role, I think is a beneficial way to go about that, right? We're able to kind of speak to, I think it's for any job, right? Is being able to speak to what you're not getting and why you want something else instead. Awesome. So next question that we have is, we have a couple questions about timing. Because you cannot apply until you actually hold your PhD. What did you do before you applied to STPF, and did you find it difficult to leave that job or position?
That's a great question, and something all potential applicants and fellows, pre-fellows think about and struggle with. I was aware of the fellowship in the last few years of grad school and thought about timing because I was excited to apply and see if I could get in. I did not want to continue, I did not want to kind of do a very common of easing from grad school and just kind of turning from grad student to postdoc in the same lab. I kind of wanted a different experience before continuing on to the fellowship. So I went ahead and applied to industries, to some startup companies and smaller biotech, accepted a position at a company I was really excited with, and then also applied to the fellowship and worked in that job, knowing that there's a small chance I would get, there's some chance I would get to the fellowship. I'd be happy to stay in this job if I didn't, but knew that in the back of my mind there may be a chance that I would need to leave this position. And ultimately, I was really grateful for the 1 year I got to spend working. I was at DSM Innovation Center in Boston. It was hard to leave the company after a year because I love the team, but it was also a really good opportunity to come to DC. And so I think my own personal path has been, it was helpful to do something outside of academia before coming to DC. This is my own personal experience, but I think I would feel a little limited having only had grad school experience, both working in the Senate and then working at the White House. I've been able to lean on that year of industry experience quite a bit. So I think everyone has to kind of shape their own life and path as it goes. And sometimes it feels like at the end of grad school, you're like, oh, let me just get out of here and go do that next thing. But I would, say consider if you want to do something with that year in between that you have, and think of it as a potential opportunity before applying for the fellowship.
Yeah, and I think, lots of fellows have different backgrounds and jump in at different career paths. There's several tenure professors who will come in and do this fellowship, long careers in one particular sector, and they become experts but want to do a year in the government and learn something new. So it's not just fellows that come right out of graduate school, although it can make it easier to make that transition if you're just looking for a temporary, what's the next step before I decide my ultimate career path or next step career path. Yeah, I applied initially during my PhD, did not get it the first time that I had applied, and actually took that extra year to really think hard about what it was that I wanted out of the fellowship, what I was hoping for, and why I was passionate about applying again, and then developing additional skills that I identified as weaknesses in my initial application. And so that extra timing for me was really helpful to nail down what my interests were, as well as just make myself a stronger applicant for the next time that I applied. I guess after graduate school, I did 1 year postdoc, and then by that time had gotten accepted to the fellowship program, and then went in. Was it difficult for me to leave my postdoc? No, I was really ready to get out. I love the lab and love the work that I was doing, but my PI was moving labs to a different state, and so there wouldn't have been much for me to do had I not moved with him. So yeah, I'd say just timing to enhance your skills, really work on things that you think might be applicable to a fellowship position that you might take, and just there is no right time, perfect time to do anything. AAAS recognizes that, and as long as you're a scientist or engineer, then you absolutely qualify.
I think that's a good lead into the next question, is that what folks are asking, what to expect after the application. So I was wondering if both of you could talk through your experiences of doing the application, and then kind of what was the semi-finalist and finalist process for you like. And since both of you have done both branches, for executive and legislative, I would kind of speak to what was different about those cycles.
My first with this one. Gosh, it feels like so long ago. So Yeah, the application, and I'm sure the website has some dates of what to expect, so I'm not going to even try to say the wrong dates. But just general procedure of what to expect. Yeah, the applications was November, and then I want to say, well, I'll add for legislative branch fellowships that are not directly through AAAS, but through partner societies. So I was funded through ASME, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, for my legislative branch fellowship, and those have different types of rolling deadlines that you might be able to submit an application all the way through beginning of January for those. I think roughly around like the February-March timeframe is when you'll start to hear back, and there'll be that first round of interviews, which is kind of just, you know, see if you can answer certain questions and then get your foot in the door to the next step. And then you become from a semi-finalist. At that point, if you make it past those questions, then you become a finalist. Finalist means that you're guaranteed, to an extent, guaranteed to have a fellowship. You know, the interest is there, and the only remaining factor is just how and when you match with a agency or an office. And that comes at different time points depending on if you go through the legislative branch or the executive branch. Executive branch fellowship, I believe we started hearing about the open positions April, May. And again, please refer to the website for actual details, but that's when we started getting a list of interested offices in the executive branch. I think we had like 300 open positions that were soliciting fellows. So you can read through that. And then there's a process of interviews directly with those offices. That's an interesting kind of matching. It's only 1 week, from what I recall, of actual interviews. And so from that big list of 300 or so, whichever depends that year, it's important to nail down what your interests are, maybe at least in terms of agency, department, area of work. That would be, you know, where you might want to go. And then for the legislative branch, yeah, that's just a 1 week interview process that doesn't happen until after the orientation, which is that September. So you'll go through 2 weeks of orientation and then 1 week of interviews with different offices on the Hill. And then once you match, you start that next week, unless there's differences with offices. But that's kind of a whirlwind process that you don't know who the offices will be until you come to DC for orientation, and then you can take a look at those, nail down or narrow down as much as you can ahead of the interview week to see who you want to interview. At some point in that process, I do recall there being a memo. I don't recall the dates of when that was. I think it might have been between the semifinalist and finalist interview period. He's shaking his head, so I'm assuming that might be correct. And that's just a kind of a 1-page memo. You get assigned a particular prompt and you have to answer it to the best of your ability within a short period of time. I think it's just a few days or a few weeks, and you're just answering a question in a form of a 1-page policy memo. That's just a high-level overview. Just, you know, it's generally spaced out, but then in those interim little weeks when there are the interviews and the selection processes, it gets very intense and it's very condensed. So planning ahead with your schedule, whichever your work schedule is, I'd say is very important, and AAAS should have all of those dates on their website to refer to. But I'll stop there and pass it over to Georgia with her experiences.
I don't think I have much to add. I think we'll hear more from like on the specific dates. So I think I will pass, and that's all.
Yeah, in the chat, you can find the link to access the timeline of things to go forward from. So, you know, as kind of like Jacqueline was saying, just making sure that you are planning ahead, thinking through like those windows, giving yourself the time to like, you know, if this is your first time writing a policy memo, right, like making sure you give yourself space to like really dig in and be comfortable in that process is important. So, you know, but again, like one of the things that I get a lot of is that it's a long process, right? And I think like being patient and understanding like there's a team of people who tons of applications who are trying to get like the best, not the best, but like a good group of folks to DC. So knowing that and like making sure that you're putting in your best foot forward too and being patient in that process is really something else. Sorry, I have something in the back of my throat. All right, next question that we got from the chat is, what are some parts of the STPF fellowship experience that are different from what you imagined when you applied?
From the application experience, the fellowship experience is what you said?
Parts of the fellowship experience that are different from what you imagined before you applied.
Okay, I will take a stab at this first. I think Jacqueline and I may have good different answers. Wow, showing up to Congress was so vastly different from anything I expected. Like, as much as you can expect something, there's just like a million other things that happen differently. And it's like a whole world of chaos, beautiful, crazy chaos. So in that sense, I kind of expected the unexpected, so maybe I got what I was looking for. But it was just a work environment on both pace of work, topics of work, and form, like how you do the work, that was very different from anything I had done before. And I think it is hard to imagine exactly what it is until you show up. And as much as I think, it's useful to talk with people and they give you some ideas of what it's like to write a policy memo, and you have some sense of what it's like to communicate with policymakers, the pace of how work is done, how you're deciding what to work on, and then what your day-to-day looks like was very different than I expected. So maybe just like paint a little bit more of a picture. And I will say that my experience in Congress was very different from my experience in the executive branch. And I think within the executive branch, time at the Department of State versus some of my friends were at Defense or NIH or NSF, those experiences were all pretty different as well. But maybe just to like paint a few broad strokes from Congress and state, and then I can pass it over to Jacqueline. I think Congress, my office in some ways was often the topics we worked on were at the whims of public media and important issues of the day. So it was very much day-to-day driven. Less than 10% of my time was on longer term sustained thinking and project development, which is maybe what you're used to doing at an industry, at a company, or as a researcher. So suddenly 90% of my brain was used for thinking about short-term items. Also, I was never the expert on anything. So I would need, even though I'm the biotech person in the office and one of the members of the climate policy team, as much as I would love to learn about wind energy generation and wind energy tax credits, I never had time to sit and read and learn the 40 hours or whatever I would like to, read for a week about wind energy. So I learned very quickly who are the people that I needed to call and who are the contacts that I needed to have in order to get policy relevant knowledge on a piece of paper to move forward in some legislative process, whether that was supporting funding for a topic, writing an oversight letter to ask some company or entity what they were doing and why they were doing it, or write a draft bill that someone might give me some of the specifics for around wind energy topic or biotechnology. And I had to turn that into something that looked like coherent but very high level policy language. So just some broad strokes about Congress. Was pretty fun and very fast paced. Also, a lot of what some of our roles were was staffing the Congress member. And so that literally means sitting behind the chair of that congressional member and feeding them talking points on something, and making sure you're there to be enough of an expert on the topic that they're speaking to. At the Department of State, I think it was not as far from what I expected. My experience there, I think I expected that I was going to a very large organization. I expected to work on international policy. I expected to learn about diplomacy and what diplomacy was and how it's created, and I did all of that. And I think it was really satisfying in the way to see how is international policy crafted. I learned that international policy is really slow often. It's really slow because it's generally consensus driven. So you need to get a lot of people to agree on multiple topics of what can be a thorny issue. So I worked on biological safety and also the Biological Weapons Convention, and that moves at a glacial pace. And that was really interesting learning experience to see what are the ways you can have an influence on a topic that might not mean, okay, we're signing a new agreement, because that will maybe only happen every couple of years. But what are all the other pieces that need to line up, like how we shape how money is used to influence implementation of the Biological Weapons Convention, or how we put in, like I worked on putting tabletop exercises in place for countries to come to the table and practice together. And so seeing how diplomacy functions was really exciting and useful. Those are a few thoughts. I'll pass over to Jacqueline.
Yeah, completely agree. Congress was definitely a whirlwind of expectations in terms of pace and needing to be an expert on things within 30 minutes. So learning how to quickly read, quickly identify sources of truth and distill that down into something that's manageable and understandable for your boss to make a decision on the floor in the next 30 minutes after that. So the pace of Congress was definitely very fast. In general, I'd agree that there's a central theme that was very different than academia, or my experiences in academia, and for both branches, in that everything was very people-centric. There had to be a lot of decisions that were made by lots of different people. There was an incredible number of stakeholders, both internally and externally. On the Hill, it's having consensus between different members of Congress, different sides of the aisle, to be able to get a bill into a right place, to be able to push it onto the House floor, to be able to have a vote and then push it further. And so it takes a lot of relationship building, a lot of listening, understanding, negotiating, and kind of behind the scenes action, but all very much people centric. And then the executive branch too, I think I had expectations that, and I'd spoken to many fellows who'd gone from congressional fellowships to the executive branch, and they said the pace is so much slower, so much smoother. You have more work-life balance. And so I was looking forward to that, but I also didn't realize that there could be some barriers and bottlenecks to getting things done because of the many people who are involved in many different questions and stakeholders, not just externally. So, on the Hill, you've got stakeholders from interest groups that are also weighing in their opinions, but just, at USAID, there's so many internal stakeholders that must sign off on certain items to get things done. I'm a data scientist in our Bureau for Humanitarian Assistance, and I'm helping to streamline or help improve the agency's or our bureau's use of data and how we can use it to improve our programming. And so small little fixes that I could see an individual making really have to go through a line of approvals before any big changes can be made, because the end user, if it's so wide, you want to make sure that there's enough input to say that this is a good idea and this should move forward. And so some things are a little bit slow, and on both sides, it's just processes. I think I'm learning a lot more about systems engineering kind of mindsets in both of these experiences. But yeah, there are lots of things that are different. And then one more thing I will say is I was pleasantly surprised and pleased at the extent of data being used to inform policy, particularly from my member of Congress that I work for. I work for Anna Eshoo of California, she of Silicon Valley, and she has been a longstanding member, and she definitely knows what she's doing, but also has just such a very strong moral compass and always wants to see the data. She wants to see the actual resource, the study, and she wants to know where it's coming from before she can make an informed decision. And I found that so refreshing, and just it made me happy to know that Congress people are like that and do utilize data to make their decisions. And so the data that you scientists and engineers get and create in grad school really it does have a place in federal government.
Can I add one other note
Yes.
to end also on a positive note? I feel like I didn't say enough positive things. I think something I was positively surprised at in both experiences in legislative and executive branch is how much fellows were used and trusted. You showed up and then people were like, okay, great, go do these things. And in some ways, I'm like, wait, I need to take a moment and figure out who to talk to and get my bearings. But I think in a very positive way, you know, depending on what office you land, of course, there are differences, but know that in a majority of offices, people see you truly as a member of the team and a large contributor. And so be ready and be expecting to jump in and provide your expertise and then just contribute as another member of the team, not as kind of an outside fellow. So I think that was a really positive experience I had.
So this is actually kind of like, I'm glad that both of you have had experience in both branches. But there are lots of questions on asking for advice on how to tailor your two program area applications. So for example, like executive versus legislative, any tips or advice that you did to kind of tailor your applications for each of those program areas? And if so, and kind of like what made you choose those program areas while applying? And Georgia, I think you actually also applied through AAAS, right, for your congressional fellowship. So can you speak to that a little bit too? I can repeat that if you need.
I think the question was how to tailor the application for legislative branch and executive branch fellowships, right?
Yes.
Okay. I guess since I'm talking, I'll take this one first, Jacqueline, then you can go. Right. I applied directly through AAAS, and for the first year was a congressional fellow through AAAS, and then I applied through the executive branch fellow and continued on as a AAAS exec branch fellow. I think tailoring your application is really important. You can't provide a generic application to both because they're two very different experiences. And I think it's important for you to show the selection committee that you understand the differences. I think it's important to identify like what you want to do in Congress generally, what might be one or two topic areas, and in both in the executive branch. But I think it's a little different in terms of Congress. You probably want to think broadly or health policy and provide an example or two within that of what you would like your contribution to be, your potential contribution to be in government. Also, that you recognize the environment. Like you've heard both Jacqueline and I talk a little bit about this intense, unique environment that is Congress. So being able to articulate, you understand what it's like and why you think you're successful. And then I think that's different from the executive branch fellowship, where the executive branch fellowship allows you to see the inner workings of the federal government and how a specific department or agency works. And so there you might not be sure, do I want to go to Department of Energy or Department of Defense, but picking a few of those agencies and speaking to why you might be excited to go be a scientist or a science policy analyst or researcher at one of those agencies and how you think you might contribute there. So I think being able to speak to a few former fellows or current fellows before you write your application is ideal. So you might have some examples of what it might be like to work in one of those two areas. But yeah, I think just like think carefully about how you can provide some context to each of the applications.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think I'll just add to, I was looking back at my application and see what did I write that's different. I think I mean, you can't change your experiences. You have your experiences and you're going to want to put, key experiences into your applications, extracurriculars or other interests. But to help distinguish the two for your applications, just strategically think about which skills you want to pull out of each experience and how you want to phrase those skills. Because the work that you'll do in the legislative branch and executive branch can be very different. So for the legislative branch, I'd say, really focus on pulling out experiences and skills, focus on communication, writing, research, being able to combine and succinctly distill down complex information into something that's readable for the particular audience. and being able to pivot and move on the fly. And there might be some experiences that you've had extracurricularly that do all of that, but at the same time might be twisted in a different way and shown that, for the executive branch, at least my experience is there is communication, and it depends on the job. Maybe we should have caveat too that like all fellows have very, very unique different jobs, even if you're in the same agency, even if they're the same team, it can all look very, very different based on your particular job description, duties, and portfolio. But for the executive branch, I've noticed it's a lot more of programming, implementation, planning, evaluating. I'm on the monitoring and evaluation team. And so just if there are areas that you think that you might want to work in the executive branch, maybe just kind of pick out and talk to fellows too who are in roles that you might want to go into and learn about their day-to-day, and then try to see, what skills they find to be most helpful for them, and what skills they're glad that they had to be able to thrive in that environment, and then see where you can kind of pull that out in your application while maintaining just, the experiences that you've had. It's just shining a different light on it and talking about it in a little bit of a different way, because there are a lot more skills that you have that you might not think that you do. And so that's also kind of a cool thing that you'll learn throughout the application process. It's scary, it's intimidating, and you want to say that, you want to meet these requirements, but in doing so, you realize, wow, I really do have this kind of experience. I can make this communication. So that's something I enjoyed.
We're getting pretty close to the end, so I want to kind of end this with one last audience question, and then we can kind of take it from there. But this is asking about, so for applicants applying this year, they'll have their fellowships overlap with the 2024 election. How could elections impact fellowships? For example, what happens if a fellow starts working with a congressperson who isn't regularly elected, or if there's a change in the executive branch that de-emphasizes science policy? So I'll just drop that one in there for you guys, and you can take it.
Jacqueline gets to go first on this.
Yeah, I don't know if I worked in an election year really, at least one that affected me.
But I can speak to it if you should address and then.
Nope.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I can speak to it a little bit because I started in 2019. And I had two experiences. One was that Senator Markey was undergoing a re-election campaign. So he was up for election that, I guess he was being primaried. So he was up for a primary, which happens a little bit before the November election in 2020. And so basically the last 6 months of my fellowship, it was a lot of his time was spent on the primary election and what was happening. And before I had applied to the fellowship, it was unclear. The Democrats were in control of Congress, were in control of all branches of the government. And so when I joined in 2019 of that fall, the Democrats were in a minority in Congress, so we were not in control. So maybe in my mind, I was like, oh, it'd be cool to pass things in Congress. And then I got there in the Senate and we were not passing things. We were doing other things, which were still very interesting and informative. Learning experience, and like ultimately we helped to lead a bipartisan bill that eventually became law. So there's definite ways to move things forward. So I will just speak to, first in Congress, you most definitely should be ready to have a flexible mindset, and that whatever the political landscape is right now, it's going to look different in 2024, no matter what. And I think know that I was excited to go try to make a positive difference. I was excited to go work on important topics with people that I believed in and that cared about issues truly. And finding those right people led me to have a really positive experience. And I think my other peers to have a positive experience. So know that even if you're in the minority and you don't have control over what's happening in Congress, there's still a lot of really positive things you can work on. And it's a really fruitful experience. And things can change at the end. And part of, I think, taking this leap to be a fellow and coming to DC is being able to deal with and adapt to change. And I think it can actually make you stronger if you deal with some big change or shift that happens, or if something happens in with your office that's unexpected and you need to switch offices. That's okay. Like, you'll find a way through. So I think know that, and I think also know that if I worked in a Democratic office, I'm a Democrat. I think there is still value for Democrats coming to DC, even if Republicans are in control of multiple houses of Congress or of the executive branch. Like, I think it is important for there to be a variety of voices. And I mostly approach, like, I don't think of myself as that political. I mostly approach the work I did in Congress initially as data-driven and science-driven policymaking. Like, that's what I cared about. And that was something that I could communicate with many people from both sides of the aisle. I will say that it was challenging. So then I worked at this Department of State when Trump was president, and that was challenging. And I think part of it were many things outside of my control, which was there was low morale. People were either quitting or being let go that were, federal employees. And still, there was a large cohort of fellows that were being spread across the federal government. And so I think we wanted to go do positive work and show that science is really important and keep carrying that baton. I think it was really important to have that voice. And so I think even, no matter how the 2024 election goes, I think it will be critical on both sides, whether you are in a environment where you can be running full steam ahead at science policy initiatives, or if you're in an environment that you need to be articulating why or fighting for why science is really critical in the policy environment. Yeah,
I don't have anything to add. That was great.
Well, thank you both. Georgia, I know you had to too, so thank you both for being here. And just in 10 seconds, if I can just give you for a little bit more, just one piece of advice you would give this group before they click submit on their application. Maybe not for 10 seconds. That's not a realistic ask.
Maybe, I'll just say, like, don't come off as a robot. Come off as like a passionate individual. Say why you care about something, and don't be afraid to have opinions. A lot of scientists, I think, are thinking a lot about logical decision making and reasoning. Show you have an opinion and you care. And I think that have some of that passion shine through.
Yeah, and I'll just say maybe be open to new experiences. I highlight that you're willing to learn, that you can learn, and that you can learn fast. I think that's one common thread through a lot of fellows, is that, while we might not know a particular topic, we can learn very quickly. And so just highlight your strengths, and you've got more strengths than you think you might have. So yeah, just go ahead and put those on paper. And good luck.
Thank you both. Thank you for sharing your experiences and wisdom. I know that. So thank you again. So some last minute housekeeping notes for everyone here. Applications are due November 1st. You have the whole day up until 11:59 p.m. If you have any questions or anything until that day, please email us at fellowships@AAAS.org, and you can reach out to us as you're working through those attendings. So thank you so much. We will not catch you at a live chat for the rest of the application cycle. But again, if you have any questions until the end, please reach us out. So good luck. Have a good one.